I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. When filmmaker Brian Ivie heard about the mass shooting at Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, he knew he had to tell the story. Not the story of the shooting, but the story of the relatives of the victims who, in court, shocked the world when they forgave the killer. That story is now told in the film Emanuel, which Ivie directed and will be released later this month. I'll have details for you at the end of the podcast. Speaking of this year's William Wilberforce weekend, Brian's topic was, can Christianity answer tragedy? A question he answered by sharing the lessons learned from the Charleston shooting and from another film he produced, The Dropbox, about a Korean pastor who rescues unwanted infants. Here is Brian Ivie at the 2019 Wilberforce weekend.
Many of you saw Brian's movie last night, Emanuel. I first met Brian Ivie whenever John Stonestreet and I wrote the book, Restoring All Things. And we saw The Dropbox, Brian's first movie, about the time we were writing that book. And we asked Brian to go on a little book tour with us to cities around the country. We fell in love with Brian. We fell in love with his movie. We fell in love with his story. And whenever we saw this movie, we just knew that it had to be a part of the Wilberforce weekend. So with no further ado, please welcome the director of a great new movie, Emanuel, Brian Ivie.
How you doing? What a trailer, huh? Very avant-garde. Thank you. I really need no introduction. Thank you for having me back. It was great to see you last night. I'm honored to be here today. Again, my name is Brian, and despite the nature of my topic, can Christianity answer tragedy? I am not a theologian. In case that was confusing, I can't imagine that it was. But I'm also from Orange County, if anybody knows where that is. Yes, you can shout that out. You can be proud. Yes, sir. Where nothing bad happens ever. So clearly I am perfectly positioned to answer the impossible question of pain and suffering. Now, I think that movies have a very curious relationship with tragedy. I can honestly not remember a single horrible event that has not been made into a movie. The Holocaust, 9/11, the Boston bombing, Pearl Harbor, Justin Bieber's Never Say Never concert series. They're all movies now. It's almost like part of our burial process as human beings, our way of logging the information. But I also think it's part of our way of making the reality of death less frightening, almost less real, so that we can keep pretending that it's not coming for us. In one of my favorite scenes from a movie called Zodiac by David Fincher, there's a character named Robert Graysmith, real guy, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Anybody seen that movie? So in the film, Jake Gyllenhaal's character is a cartoonist for the San Francisco Chronicle, and he's working during the reign of terror of the Zodiac killer, but he becomes obsessed with trying to figure out who this guy is, so obsessed that he actually seeks out the lead detective on the case, played by Mark Ruffalo, and he meets him outside of, wouldn't you know it, a movie theater, where they're playing the 1971 film, this is true, The Zodiac Killer, which came out during the Zodiac's reign of terror, where they still could not find him. And in this amazing scene, Jake Gyllenhaal's character runs up to the detective and says, "You're going to catch him. I know you're going to catch him." And in this perfect moment, the detective looks at him and goes, "Pal, they're already making movies about it." In other words, we have already moved on. I've wanted to make movies ever since I was 9 years old. Ever since I knew you could make movies and not just watch them, which was terrifying for my parents, of course. But I remember the first time I knew I wanted to make movies, and I was sitting on a hillside in Orange County, and I had my dad's video camera, and I was pointing it up to the sky, and as I did that, a bird flew through the frame, and I followed it. And I just remember this thought rushing into my head, I can keep that. It was a moment of permanence in a world that just did not feel permanent at all. As the great theologian Michael J. Fox, otherwise known as Marty McFly, once said, "Pain is temporary, but film is forever." Every summer growing up, I would make movies with my friends. I would literally go door to door, inviting all of the neighborhood kids out to make a movie with me, and I would find the kids who looked most like elves or trolls and cast them in my adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring. Okay, we literally made Lord of the Rings every single summer. I did not have a girlfriend for many years. We would also make adaptations of Harry Potter with no Hermione, of course, and also thank you, several people. And we'd also make an adaptation of James Bond, starring my brother as James Bond in our film called James Bond. In high school, I started a cinema club and even directed a film noir called Blood Letters, which was even distributed on YouTube. My parents also took this opportunity to encourage me to become an entertainment lawyer. Thanks, Mom. After high school, I applied to film schools and was somehow, by the grace of God, accepted into the USC film program, which is and remains a 1% acceptance rate. They say harder than Harvard Law. Home to some of the greatest directors who have ever lived. If you've ever been to USC Film School and you walk through the iron gates, there are two names you're going to see right away inscribed in stone: Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, making you feel immediately inadequate. What you will find out, however, as soon as you get involved in the USC culture and lore, is that Steven Spielberg was actually rejected from the USC film program, and then later decided to buy the film school. So all you hear in your head as you look up at his name in stone is, "You blew it. You blew it." So life was going great for me. I was pursuing my dream of being a filmmaker. I just had one problem. I had been assigned a dorm room with an evangelical Christian, which, as we all know, are the most annoying breed of Christians. His name, quite appropriately for this weekend, was Will. I called him God's Will. Will and I would stay up late talking all the time, and I found his faith annoyingly authentic, because he used "I don't know" as an answer to certain questions. And we would ask the big questions. Well, okay, what about the guy on the deserted island who never got a chance to hear the gospel? Is that really fair? Did Adam have a belly button? I mean, honestly, think about that. And where is God when bad things happen? Where is God when bad things happen? I never had to ask that question in my life because nothing bad really happened to me. I still had both of my grandparents. Life was really good. Will and I continued those conversations for a couple years until I read about a tragedy that changed the course of my entire life. On June 20th, 2011, I read an article in the Los Angeles Times in a physical newspaper. I'm older than I look. Called "South Korean Pastor Tends an Unwanted Flock," and it was all about a man in South Korea who had built a mailbox for abandoned babies into the wall of his church. Literally a drop site for women to leave kids that they couldn't take care of or didn't want. And the majority of those kids had physical disabilities or deformities. At the time, Lee had rescued about 40 children through the box. To date, he's rescued over 1,000. Now, normally, when you read a story like that, you think, that's really sad, and then you move on. But I just could not get it out of my head. So I decided I was going to Google Translate an email to Pastor Lee from my assistant, Cheryl. So Cheryl sends this email out to Pastor Lee at honmail.net or whatever it was, saying that I would like to go and make a documentary film about this man who built this mailbox for abandoned babies. And surprisingly, he emailed me back, clearly in a Google translated email. And it said this: "Dear Brian, this is Pastor Lee. I don't know what it means to make a documentary film about my life exactly, but you can come live with me if you want." And so I said, "See you soon, Pastor Lee." Of course, we had no money. So we had to raise the money on Kickstarter. Does anybody know what that is, Kickstarter? Okay, Kickstarter is essentially an online fundraising platform where you set a financial goal for a project or a piece of technology, and then you beg all of your friends and family to help you reach the goal. Okay, it's essentially like just asking your friends and family for money. But we raised it all. $20,000 from Christians all over the world that I'd never met before who believed in what God was doing. I, of course, as somebody who wasn't sure what I believed in, thought, well, I think you mean you believe in what I'm doing. Oh, was I in for a surprise. 3 months later, myself, God's will, my little brother, and 10 of my friends who used to star as Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas in all of my movies, we flew 6,000 miles to Seoul, South Korea, to make a movie about the man who built a mailbox for abandoned babies. The first day I met Pastor Lee, he was very excited to introduce me to his son. Very excited. So he brought me up to his bedroom, and as I walked in, I saw a boy laying in the bed. This boy's name was Unman. Now, Unman's legs were jutting out and around his head. He was missing about half of his face because they had to remove it for a brain tumor. And I came to learn that he had spent the last 25 years on the flat of his back, 14 of those years in the hospital. And this was my first lesson about tragedy. And that was that Christianity does not help you avoid tragedy. Oftentimes, it's actually the opposite. At some point in those first few days, Pastor Lee told me his testimony, which is a word I'd never heard before. But he told me his story. He said that I used to be a violent drunk. I used to beat people. He told me a story about how he beat one man so badly that the guy could not open his eyes for 3 weeks. He told me that he had made a vow to never have children because he felt like it was a complete waste of time. Then one day, while Pastor Lee was at his construction job, he heard a man, an evangelical Christian, preaching about forgiveness. The man's name was Will. I'm, of course, kidding. I do not know what the man's name was. For some reason, on that day, Lee could not resist, and he gave his life to God on the spot. And do you know what Lee's first prayer was to God? It was, Lord, please give me a son. And that son was Unman. In screenwriting, there is a very common technique used called plant and payoff. It's essentially where a writer plants something early on in a story, such as an object or a face, something that doesn't make sense until it pays off later in the story. In the movie Crash, we see in the very first scene a character named Farhad who is buying a gun. But his daughter, who's with him, sensing that her father might be a little trigger-happy, decides to buy him a box of blanks instead of bullets. At the end of the film, Farhad gets into an altercation with a man named Daniel, who he thinks has stolen something from his store. During the altercation, Farhad pulls the gun, but Daniel's little daughter runs in between them to protect her father, and the gun goes off. Only there's no blood, because there were no bullets in the gun. When I first saw Unman, all I could see was pain. I was honestly afraid of him. But what I came to find out is that it was Unman who gave his father the heart to care about the ugly and the unlovable in the first place. It was Unman who inspired his father to build that box into the wall. It was in Unman's hospital room where Pastor Lee adopted 9 other disabled children. As Pastor Lee would tell you to this day, my son was my teacher. He taught me the value of every human life. It was Unman who saved them all. That was my second lesson about tragedy, and it was this: Christianity gives purpose to pain. Christianity gives purpose to pain. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." I should know this, because this is how I became a Christian while making this movie, The Dropbox. I guess I was part of the story too. the first time I saw Amanda, she was standing waist deep in a fountain in front of Levy Library at USC. Only she wasn't drunk like most people on a Thursday night who were swimming in fountains. She was about to be baptized. Per usual, God's will had invited me here to watch this, thinking somehow it would convert me to his cult. And I remember thinking two things. This girl is gorgeous, and she's completely out of her mind. Little did I know that a few years later, after making the film and going on my own journey, I would also be baptized in the fountain at USC, and Amanda would become my wife. Our wedding was beautiful. I could honestly not stop crying as she walked down the aisle. It was actually a problem during the ceremony. And I think it was because I just never believed that day would come. After everything I'd done in my life, toward women and otherwise, I just thought it was too good to be true. After we got married, Amanda and I went on our honeymoon to Cancun. And on the first morning, I remember I stepped out onto the balcony with my Bible, and I looked out at this beautiful sunrise. And then I heard my wife crying in the bedroom, bawling. And I walked in, and I'm kind of like, I didn't think it was that bad. I mean, I know we didn't rehearse this because we're Christians now, but okay. But then Amanda looked at me, and with those tears in her eyes, she just said, 9 people just got shot in their Bible study. And I said, what are you talking about? Now, see, a Bible study was a place I knew pretty well at this point. And she said, Charleston, South Carolina, white kid, black church, shot and killed 9 people, sat with them for 45 minutes. When they bowed their heads to pray, shot the pastor first, then one by one by one. I mean, what do you do? And then she looked at me again. She said, no, you don't understand. She was watching a video on her laptop. She said, they're forgiving him. The family members are forgiving the murderer in court. And I looked at her, and I remember saying, man, I hope whoever tells that story one day does not skip that part. Because I think God just showed up. I had no idea that that person would be me. Lesson 3, Christianity always responds with love. Christianity responds with love to victims of violence and tragedies of all forms, of course. For people who have suffered loss, God promises not only his presence, but his justice. As Pastor Lee would always tell me, God will not be mocked, son. You will reap what you sow. Ultimate justice will be done, and that is a good thing. But Christianity also responds with love toward those who caused the tragedy. That's not something people like to talk about. But for me, it was good news. I've often wondered why it was that God decided to pick me to tell this story about the shooting in Charleston. I'd never been to Charleston. And quite honestly, when you look up white privilege in the dictionary, it's just a picture of me on a bicycle. It doesn't really make sense. Often people have said that I will never understand the black experience, so I'm the wrong person to tell the story. And they're right, I don't. I will never understand a wound that cuts that deep. But I do understand what it means to be forgiven. The declaration that changed my life was not that God has a wonderful plan for you or that God wants a relationship with you. It was one verse. It was, he made him who knew no sin to become sin so that through him we might become the righteousness of God. That verse changed my whole life. In the course of the interviews, I had a lot of questions for the family members, obviously. But as you would expect, there was one that stood apart from all the others, and it was, where was God when the gun was going off? Where was God when it mattered most? Polly Shepard, now a good friend, she survived the shooting that night. She was actually left alive on purpose by the shooter, saying, I'm going to leave you here so you can tell this story. And when Polly stands on stage now, she likes to say, the shooter left me alive to tell you about him, but I'm here to tell you about Jesus Christ. I asked Polly in the interview, where was God in the room on that night? And she said something to me that I still don't fully understand. She said, there were two lights in the room. There was the light of the laser of the gun, and there was the light of the Lord's presence. That's some deep theology there, boy. She said that though it was night, in the room it felt like dawn. When Jesus died, the Bible says darkness covered the whole land. When Polly's friends died, she said that it wasn't dark at all. Lesson 4, Christianity offers a God who made himself a tragedy. In my industry, and in this generation more specifically, it's no longer just about what's true. It's really more about what's beautiful. Which is why I think this conference is so important, and why I'm always looking for stories of tragedy, because that is when, in those moments where Christianity stands apart from every other option. After all, what would a God who is not acquainted with suffering and tragedy have to offer a world that has suffered so greatly? The answer is absolutely nothing. Any more than a kid who has played Call of Duty his whole life has anything to offer a man who has just come home from Iraq. We do not only have a God who is real, we have a God who is worthy of our allegiance. We do not serve Edward the Longshanks, we serve William Wallace. A suffering world cries out for a suffering God. And in the person of Jesus Christ, the man who bore the cross on his back, we have one. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. The film Emanuel, directed by Brian Ivie, will be showing in theaters June 17th and 19th. For more information, go to emmanuelmovie.com. That's Emmanuel with one M, movie.com. Or of course, you can come to breakpoint.org and click on this podcast, and we'll link you to it. I also want to let you know that June 30th is the end of the Colson Center's fiscal year. If you're enjoying the Breakpoint podcasts, we'd really appreciate you considering a donation to help us end the year strong. Just come to breakpoint.org and click on Give. Thank you. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.